Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at The Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to The Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos Reyes and regular panelist Christopher Zender. Our special and very welcome guest, he's visited once before, is Zeb Baccelli. Zeb Baccelli, an American Solidarity Party from Pennsylvania, who has a great deal to teach us about agriculture and how it shapes our own culture. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful, and the same Spirit help us to relish what is right, and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Now, just a word of introduction about Zeb. Members of the American Solidarity Party have profited from his many and thoughtful posts, and we've learned a lot, if only indirectly, through his interaction with Amish people. He's working in Pennsylvania, and he really understands agriculture in a way that many members of the party would like to, but we have to confess we don't. So he's a go-to person in that area. And I might say our regular panelist, Christopher Zender, has done some farming of his own. I'm aware of some of his farming efforts from the days not so very long ago when he lived on the left coast in the tiny town of Tehachapi. Well, actually, it's not that tiny. So Christopher is very keen on understanding our culture through agriculture, and Zeb is doing so on a regular basis. It's part of his work. And so I'm going to start with a general question, although we have some very particular questions as well that our gentle listeners have submitted to us. But let me start with this. Beside the fact that it provides us with food, why should we care so much about agriculture? Do farming practices, which can vary widely, impact society outside the farm fields? If so, how? In other words, how does, and this is a solidarity question, how does how we farm impact the common good? And I'm going to add a personal point to this. I've already packed 4 questions into one. Once upon a time, when I first began political activity at the Catholic Worker, it was very much in the context of Cesar Chavez and the organization of the United Farm Workers. And many's the time in my youth, which wasn't that long ago, heck, when my wife and I carried signs in front of major grocers that said, "No uvas," the grape boycott. But enough prologue. Let's get to the meat of things. Zeb, can you get us going here?
Sure, yeah. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me on. It's nice to be with you. So why should we care about agriculture? Well, agriculture is the foundation of civilization in every society. In our modern world, a lot of people at least tend to think of agricultural products as just one of the things that our society produces alongside all the other consumer goods that are available to us. And we see it on the store shelf next to paper plates and diapers and shoes and iPhones. And it's just one more thing that you have to buy. But that really disguises the foundational importance of farming, because all those other things could go away and we could still survive as long as we still had food production going. And as the way food production is organized now, also food distribution going. But when production or distribution gets disrupted, we see a total breakdown of society and, of course, a loss of human life. Famines occur in either type of situation. If there's a loss of production or distribution, people starve, institutions break down, and culture goes away. So even though we've really modernized and gotten the vast majority of people, at least in developed countries, off the land and into the cities and suburbs and out of agricultural production and into producing goods and services for the consumer market, food production is still the foundation and the basis of civilization itself. And I would say that the farmer is the second most important job to humanity next to the mother. It's the second most essential role to fill. So it's very important how we produce food, because everything else is based on that foundation. And how food is produced has a really big impact on the culture and the society, even if you're not one of the people doing the production. The most obvious way is that the way we treat land affects everybody who's around that land. And so modern agriculture, which is heavily based on large equipment, centralization, standardization, and especially on chemical inputs, tends to create a mode of production that is deleterious to the land. It takes away its productive capacity over time, but also causes a lot of externalities, especially toxic pollution that ends up poisoning the waters from the people who live next to or downstream, and ends up destroying even coastlines and fisheries, and takes away that productivity and that public good there. But another really important way that the way we produce food impacts our whole society is the way that labor is impacted. And so you were talking about the United Farm Workers and the fact that American produce production relies heavily on migrant workers. And for most of its, at least 20th and 21st century history, has relied heavily on undocumented migrant workers who are prone to being exploited because they don't have recourse to public and government protections or to unions. And so that creates this massive disparity in this underclass of marginalized people, and which ends up becoming, as you probably know, in California and states that have large populations of migrant workers, a source of social strife. Not to mention, of course, from a Catholic perspective, just being inherently immoral in itself, that people are being treated this way and exploited this way. And that overall just leads to an approach to the land and to creation, which is exploitive, because there's this disconnect between the good that comes from it and the people who are consuming that good and the people who are doing the production. And whether that's the migrant worker who is working long, hard hours for low pay, and being alienated from the product of their labor, or whether it's the owner who's exploiting those people to be competitive in the market and who is shipping those products thousands of miles away and has no connection to the people who are consuming the thing that he's producing. That disconnect leads to an exploitive attitude towards creation itself, which I think is just demoralizing overall and has a negative impact on our cultural values kind of across the board.
That's a really comprehensive analysis. Christopher, you want to go a little bit particular on some of those points?
Yeah, I think we need to. I'd like to cordon some of them off and maybe examine them. Excuse me. You talked about how agriculture is foundational to civilization, and I think with Wendell Berry, somebody pointed out that there's a cognate relationship between culture and cultivation, or cultivation that we have in agriculture and culture that when we look upon as characterizing human society. Do you think there's only an accident of history that, okay, so, culture rises from agriculture. Maybe that was necessary for the time, the ancient world. But we can simply have, why can't we simply have a culture which is equally as respectable, equally as good as the culture that rises from agriculture? If there's a connection between culture and agriculture, why should we prefer a culture that is rooted in the earth, as with agriculture, over a culture which may be rooted in urban and suburban context?
Yeah, well, I think it's really a matter of human nature, and if we look at the creation story in the early part of the book of Genesis, initially Adam was tasked with the vocation of tending the garden, and after the fall, he was given we think of it as a punishment or the curse that he'll have to eat by the sweat of his brow. But this was the nature of humanity from the very beginning. It is what we are, is creatures that cultivate. And the sense of culture that refers to like the arts and sciences and all that really is a metaphor based on, calling that culture is a metaphor based on agriculture, on farming, on tending the land. And all of those things came initially from the first vocation of man, which was to tend the land. And so like cities were built around places where farming could happen, because farming was able to produce more than enough for just the person making the food, and enabled people to become priests and scribes and that kind of thing in the very, very, very early days. And farming was so foundational to human experience that the notion of cultivating the arts and the sciences, or cultivating a person in learning and education, comes from that experience of having had to care for and tend and raise up a product out of the ground. And so that very kind of concept of just caring for and tending something in order that it can bear fruit. I mean, literally, we can't talk about this kind of thing without accidentally using agricultural metaphors, because I think that's just the nature of humanity. That is what we are. That's what we do. And even if we've been divorced from the literal activity of it, at least most of us have in more recent decades of the last century, we still have that inherent sense that the two are related, and that what we are essentially is things that care for and tend. And if we're displaced from the land, then we care for and tend to other things. But I think if we lose that connection consciously and don't maintain it in some direct way, I think a lot of social ills come from not having that direct experience of the need to cultivate and the consequences of doing that poorly or thoughtlessly in the literal sense, that then we could translate into how to cultivate other sort of more abstract things.
Yeah. So, do you think there's something inherent about being close to the soil that is necessary for man? Thinking of
yeah, I do.
And I'm thinking it's like in earlier, like medieval cities. Like I think medieval Florence was like 15,000 people, which is it would be a town nowadays, right?
Yeah.
And people you actually often, I know in medieval German cities, you had pigs running through the streets, and there was actually very close. Even people, city dwellers, knew farming to some extent. Why is it so important that we be close to the soil? I think.
Well, I think in my opinion, the most important reason is that I think that farming is the greatest cure to hubris. Somebody who's making their living on the land becomes very aware in a short time of how vulnerable they are and how out of control they are of the world and of their fate, and of the need to study and observe and submit to an order that is not of their own creation. And so if you're farming, you know that you have to be very attentive to things like the weather and soil conditions and the movement of animals and insects and diseases and the nature of each kind of crop that you're growing. And you have to synthesize all that and respect it, and do your best, but be prepared for the unknown to strike and have a really big impact on your living for that year. And you're always kind of at the mercy of the elements in that way. And that is a metaphor for, I think, and makes a person who's into farming very aware of our natural relationship with God himself, who is somebody who we can't know or control, but must be attentive to and submissive to. And when you live in a completely fabricated and artificial environment, it's much easier for us to control, like how things work in a city and in an office and in a service kind of sector, and to create the illusion that we have complete control and that it's all rational and we can understand it all and be the masters of everything. And so that allows us to fall into hubris, but it only delays and I think magnifies the eventual falls that we run into and leaves us unprepared for them. So when people, even if they're not farmers themselves, have a close connection with the farming world, they, I think, are kept a lot more in check about the real nature of life itself and of our relationship to creation and to God, and the way that we can't think of ourselves as masters and in control of everything, but have to be observant and humble and submissive.
I guess that may be a reason why, too, it might be good for city people to cultivate some kind of garden, right? Even if it's just on boxes on their windowsill. I was wondering, now, Mario, do you have
I'm going to half in jest draw Mario into this conversation. Yeah. Mario, depending on how the national football season works out, Super Bowl and all of that, makes a big deal out of Kansas. And yet we know that Kansas has had a checkered career, and we know that Kansas has had a struggle with the land. And Mario, when it comes to dealing with hubris, do people in Kansas, do they know how everything is in God's hands, and they better not push their luck?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and my experience has been that I have a friend, a colleague who teach where I do teach, and he has a small farm. He owns a small farm, and I go and visit him and see how hard he works in his farm. And however, we always discuss the issue of culture. How far is the culture almost everywhere in the United States away from this farming culture, if you will. And so that propose such a economic model, I don't know if that is a proper terms, go back to farming, sometimes feel as it is a little utopian. And so the question for us, or for me sometimes, is that it's true that when you go there, you see the effort made by farmers, small farmers, and deal with the weather and other inconvenience and realities that you cannot control. Is a learning experience, but at the same time, you look around the economic system, trade and everything else, and big farm owned by corporations, which follow a different logic. It's a different world. And so I feel as if we are living in a unreal world, or some very small world. And so my question is to how then we go and propose the viability of this system beyond the moral argument. In other words, how can we make the case, an economic case, that farming is the way to go? Because looking at the platform of our party, the American Solidarity Party, we are proposing to some extent farming and get rid of the subsidies of the big companies and so on. But that has been always my question. How do we build or rebuild that connection between the soil and the family, so to speak, when you are being raised in a different culture, suburban, urban culture, which is completely different in their view of reality, if you will?
Yeah, that's a great question and a huge question. Do you want me to address that right now?
Yes, please.
So when you look at the transition of developed countries that have happened over the last 150 years and that is continuing to go on in the developing world, of the huge mass of the population being moved from a farming subsistence to some kind of manufacturing or service subsistence and moving from rural places to urban places, that didn't happen naturally or without intervention or artificial kind of stimulation. That was, I wouldn't say exactly a conscious choice, although to some extent it was, to affect that particular change, but it came from policies that were chosen for, well, ultimately for the benefit of increasing capital and the power of the owners of capital. So there's some kind of particular ways that has worked, like the Green Revolution, which made farming a lot more capital intensive, where you had to invest in larger and larger equipment and facilities and more inputs to displace labor and remove the cost of labor, but increase the cost of capital and bought inputs into farming. That increased production per acre a lot, and per man hour especially. But there are other ways that could have been done that wouldn't have had that same effect of displacing populations and leading to all the very costly externalities that caused. And the fact that those externalities, namely pollution, destruction of productive capacity, and the social ills that were caused by disrupting people's traditional ways of life, were not factored into the prices of the products that came from those farms. And so in a way, that so-called cheap food is heavily subsidized by society just absorbing those externalities, and by the state doing a lot to help and promote that process. Like the fertilizer and pesticide industry and technology has been largely advanced by state investment, both directly through the universities and trying to research and develop these particular ways of increasing production, and not investing in ways that were that wouldn't have become products for big companies, but just would have been techniques and technologies that farmers could use without having to buy them again every year. And so wouldn't have been profitable products, but still would have been beneficial to society. Those ways were not invested in, but ways that led to product development, which could be resold every year and build huge global corporations. Those are what we're invested in. But also the two world wars led to a heavy investment in chemical production for munitions, which then were later turned, the same similar processes and factories could be used to make fertilizers and pesticides. And so it really jump-started a lot of industrial agricultural production, which then led to the displacement of rural people because their land was bought up by big agricultural producers, and the people couldn't, like, prices were driven down, and so the people couldn't produce food in a way that was sustaining to them, and they all moved to the cities to take jobs in the factories. And so how could that kind of thing be reversed if we wanted to reverse it? It would be by factoring in, through policy, the price of those externalities. So taxing, like a carbon tax would be one way. Modern farming is extremely carbon dependent, both for production in making the chemicals and running the big farm equipment, and in transportation, because a lot of our food comes from thousands of miles away. And transportation is heavily subsidized by the oil industry and by the highway systems that are not fully paid for by the industries that use those. And then shifting the investment in research into techniques and technologies that can be used by small farmers and indigenous people to increase productivity in a way that can meet the market demand without making them dependent on inputs from big agribusinesses, but things that they can use that are more knowledge-based and technique-based rather than product-based. So I don't think we can ever get to, like, rewind the clock and go back to a day when 90% of people were making their living on the land. But we can certainly go forward in a way that allows more people, at least the people who want to make a living on the land. Because even at this point where only, I think in America, it's about 2% of people are farming, farms continue to go bankrupt in high numbers every year, even as few of them as there are, because of the pressure of industrialized production. Mm-hmm. And those people don't want to leave the farm. They want to continue farming. But the wild fluctuations in commodity prices and the oversaturation of the market because of competition from across the country and across the globe makes it impossible for a small farm to make a living, or at least not impossible, but harder and harder, just producing for the people in their own area. So we could reinvest into systems of production and distribution that enable people who want to farm, rather than in ways that make it harder and harder for those people to do that.
Let me interject here. I think you're pointing us in exactly the right directions. I have a couple, 3 points that I want to make. And the first is a kind of a teacher's aside. I think I know what you're referring to when you speak about externalities, but I think it would help our listeners if you did a 3-minute analysis of that term.
Yeah, sure. Well, when a farm applies nitrogen fertilizer to their field in order to double their production of corn per acre, and a certain percentage of that nitrogen ends up running off because of rainfall into the river, and then that fertilizer flows down into the Gulf of Mexico and leads to an algae bloom that kills all the shrimp off the coast of Louisiana. that farmer is not paying for the killing of those shrimp and the loss of that productivity, or the loss of water quality and the cost of treating that water to make it potable for the people who depend on that water. The cost of that use of that fertilizer, the full cost of it is not being charged to the farmer or to the people who are buying that farmer's corn. It's being absorbed by the people who are downstream. And so in that way, those people who are downstream are subsidizing that production technique, that way of boosting increased production without agreeing to or without even knowing that they're doing that. They're being forced to subsidize it by eating that cost. And there are so many ways that externalities of industrialized farming are not accounted for and not charged to the production and to the product. Carbon release is another really important one. Obviously, there's no cost to burning fuel or to manufacturing fertilizer based on the carbon that's let out into the atmosphere, and yet we know now that carbon is causing global warming, which is causing probably billions or trillions of dollars of losses over the long term. And those losses are being eaten by the people who are being impacted, not by the producers who are causing that loss. So that's an externality. It's something that the cost that comes from an activity but is not charged to the people involved in that activity. Instead, it's just eaten by the people on the outside.
Okay, so what you don't see and maybe can't see counts a whole lot.
I have a question.
Yes,
if I may, apropos of that. You talk about the producers having to bear the cost of their externalities, but part of Ohio, in Ohio, more towards the west, you have these they're corporate farms. They're big places, and where I live, more towards the east, the farms become increasingly smaller. And as I've been told, at least, and it seems that I've read, is that the smaller farmers, they have a hard time even continue in business. If we start having them pay for the externalities, it seems that might break a lot of small farmers, which would be kind of even if they're not maybe doing the kind of agriculture we would like them to do, nevertheless, actually kind of goes against our whole goal of increasing the number of farmers. Is the problem with externalities? It seems like in some ways the small farmer is a victim of something else himself, and he's actually put in a situation, in a context where he feels compelled to do this kind of agriculture, even if he doesn't want to. So, how could we? Is there a way we could actually pay for those externalities without burdening the smaller farmers? Is this something that maybe society as a whole needs to address?
Yeah. Well, at least if we're going to have a market economy, somebody has to pay for those. And if you want the production of those externalities to decrease, at least in proportion to the cost of them, then that price has to be put into the market. I don't think that paying for them, like socializing those costs, would not lead to them being reduced in any way. Mm-hmm. So how do we tie those costs to the production system itself without destroying the farming sector, and especially small farmers? Well, I think a lot of people know, but some maybe don't, that the portion of income that people spend on their food has gone drastically down in the last, say, 70 years. And go ahead.
Go ahead.
So we used to, even when people were making less, spend a lot more on food, which meant that we spent less on things like consumer goods and services. And it's it's certainly not politically popular to go around saying we need to increase the price of food and people need to spend more on food and have less to spend on the other things they like. But the flip side of that is that wages have not gone up, and so people aren't as able to spend more on food. And that is really just a problem with capitalism, something that the American Solidarity Party wants to address by developing a more distributist economic system where there's less income inequality, so people have more money to spend on food production or food purchasing and on the cost of production. So if we were to incorporate the cost of those externalities into the production system, it would disincentivize using, say, chemically produced fertilizers and heavy equipment and long-distance transportation. And at the same time, though, it would make more sustainable and humane production methods more viable because they would be able to compete better on price with those other systems. And if people, like consumers who aren't farmers, had more money to spend on food, or more money to spend generally, they could afford to spend more on food, and therefore would see the cost, like if they saw the true cost, including the externalities of industrially produced food, next to food that was produced in a organic way or just a more sustainable and humane way, they would have less problem making that decision to support the more sustainable way of production.
So, in a sense, in a way, right? It's the question of agriculture is a question of societal-wide justice. Many of these problems could be addressed if we just had justice across the board in terms of wages, in terms of burdens, and the like. Does that sound about right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Can I interject here a comment that was submitted by Heather Alf, and I think it gives us a very concrete experience to discuss. She writes, so I was an organic farmer for about 5 years. 2 of those years we made a living mostly by my husband teaching college as an adjunct. After I got pregnant with my 6th child, I was unable to carry out farm chores, so we hired help. Here was the problem. We wanted to pay a living wage, but at that rate we're crippled. Basically, my husband had to go back to work full-time, and we had to move because the commute was too long. We still own our farm and would love to go back. And Zeb, I think you made a point about how people would like to be doing this. I guess that this is a big question for me. How can you expect a small business to pay a minimum, let alone a just wage? I don't know if in our current society it is possible to start and continue a small farm without community support. I'm sure Heather Alf would welcome your comments on that question.
Yeah, so on the sort of immediate level, she's totally right. It is very hard for a person to get into farming or for a small farm that ends up being isolated to survive. So I work with a group of Amish farmers. There's 16 farmers in a community that's maybe about 30 families. And by banding together, they're able to reach a much bigger market and to sort of compete more on the level of larger scale corporate farms because altogether they have that capacity. And at the same time, when a family starts out and they only have small kids and those kids are not able to help with production and the mother's not able to very much because she's taking care of the little kids, the other farmers in the community will help that family get set up and take care of, come over and help with some of the bigger jobs that are involved in producing whatever it is that they're growing for their economic part of their income. And so by having a community of support, they're able to survive in a very difficult and hostile economic market environment. Of course, that's not available to most people who want to get into farming. They can't just join a large, vibrant, and stable community like the Amish have established. And so on the longer term scale, I think, number one, increasing income for working people and just regular people, so that the people around you can support what you're doing on your farm, is an important part of it. That's not seen as agricultural policy, but there's this kind of dream, and sometimes distributism certainly gets too far into sort of idealistic and fanciful solutions. It's like the idea of farmer markets and community-supported agriculture being the way to influence society, I think is a little too fanciful, because you can only have, like, people are only going to buy so much of their food at the farmers market. They're going to still buy most of it at the grocery store. Most people are not going to bother with the farmers market at all. But that said, if people had more money to spend, they would be more able and willing and interested in going to the farmers market and buying higher quality stuff from people they can meet and talk to. But that speaks to the need for a lot more support for smaller and medium-sized farms to be able to even get access to the market at all. And there's a lot of ways that the system is just totally biased against any kind of farm that is not a large corporate enterprise. The difficulty of getting into grocery stores, as grocery stores themselves get more, the number of different independent ones are dwindling and getting bought up by larger chains who are not willing to work with small local producers but have contracts with big multinational production companies. Makes it hard for a small or even a medium-sized farm to get into the business or to stay in it as things change. So policies about corporate concentration and the way that we subsidize farming and distribution needs to be shifted to be more helpful to small and beginning farmers, and to help them to get more professional and larger scale, so that they're not just growing a few rows of this and that to take to the farmers market, but are able to grow a few acres of higher volume product and really become a part of the mainstream food system, and not just this little niche kind of aesthetic thing for like a hobby kind of situation, which is what ends up happening to a lot of people who try to get into it in an overly idealistic way.
Let me add one more comment that was submitted. This is from Shane Ian Hoffman, and again, it's a practical and structural point, and it's just an opening. It's not anything more than pointing to a topic. He tells us there's currently a discussion going on regarding the estate taxes effect on family farms. What's that discussion all about, and what's at issue there?
That's mostly a red herring. A farm can be worth a lot of money, especially like my dad comes from a farm in southeastern Pennsylvania in Chester County that was all farm country when they bought it in the 60s, and has become mostly McMansions now, and so land prices are really high. And his brothers who are still there, if they were to sell that farm, which was bought for like $50,000, it would probably sell for $10 million. And if they die, I'm not sure what the estate tax sort of baseline is, but the taxes on that might be pretty high. But most farms are able to, like when my grandfather passed that farm to them, he did that while he was still alive. And with proper planning, you can pass a family-sized farm on to the next generation without getting hit with that estate tax. So the estate tax has a threshold, and I forget what it is right now, but it's fairly high, and high enough that most just family farms wouldn't be impacted by it. What gets impacted is really large corporate farms. But it's used, the fact that it can impact farms is used as a way to prevent really wealthy people from being impacted by an increase in the estate tax. So I think it's unfortunate. It's a way that family farms are used as a symbol to shield the wealthy, and it doesn't really have much to do with their well-being.
Seth, I have a question. And I think it's the religious question about this. You were mentioning about the development of historical development, how we got here and how we build this industrial civilization and urban civilization, all that. When I look at the history of Latin America and why is that we don't have this farming culture, we can trace back to colonial times where the state, the Spanish state, the monarchy owned the land. And generally, they allocated that land to landowners. A big portion of land were owned by people who were nobles and so on. And so in order to work on the land, they have peasants. So generally, historically, Latin America doesn't have a tradition of farming or farmers rather than landowners and peasantry. So that was generally what triggered many revolt and revolution and all that, so that people wanted to have an agrarian reform, which is divide the land. So over the past, let's say, 50 years, many centrist parties, I would call Christian Democratic Party, tried to develop policies to reform that land. However, the reform was such that they began dividing the land and giving to peasants on behalf of social justice. Now, what happened and has happening very often is the peasant who happened to be given land begin selling the land and moving to urban areas because they don't know how to farm. And so the questions move up to the agricultural question is that what do we need to do in order this peasant to have a culture that prompt them to farming? Because they don't have that culture. They don't know how to do it. They may have some machineries, but they don't have these skills or vocation, if you will. Now, that's the situation even as we speak. Now, parallel to that, there has been many immigrants coming from different Eastern European countries, mostly Mennonites, who colonize different regions. And yet these communities today are running flourishing farms and cooperative. And they look like they are a country without a country. And so, and that's very interesting, I think. So what is my question? And that's not only my question, the question that many people are asking today is that vocation for farming, building cooperative entail that one community has to have a particular religious outlook. In other words, do we need to know what the Mennonite worldview is or Amish? Because it seems that this culture doesn't begin with other religious tradition, at least has been the case in Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's essentially religious, but certainly the faith that those communities shares binds them together and provides a way for them, or sort of a hub or a locus around which they pass down knowledge and values and expectations regarding how farming is done, or just generally how stewarding resources and capital is done. And that can be stripped from people by oppressive relationships, and not just capitalist wage labor, but I mean we see in the United States how that was done to African Americans who for 400 years were doing farming in America, but were not given power over how that farming was done, and then not given land or equality when they were freed from the slavery relationship, and so have struggled to become self-sufficient and well-established farming communities themselves, even though they had that background in doing farm labor for so long. I think the same thing is true with peasants, in Europe as well, places where peasants were, or the serfs were freed from that bondage, did not have the culture that enabled them to become free-holding, successful farmers. And I think this is where what I was talking about, how we could have invested differently to modernize agriculture and could still change how we invest going forward. And you mentioned skills and vocation, and I think if farming were treated the same way that by society and by the state as like engineering or as medical work is done, as a highly skilled and technical profession that people can get into and that is valued by society, it's not just what you default to if you don't have any other more valuable skills. And at the same time, if we developed, and the sort of independent organic movement has done a lot to develop very advanced and scientific know-how that doesn't require external inputs, but just requires the farmer to be educated and careful, and sort of replaces those bought-in inputs with knowledge and planning instead of just buying solutions from a agribusiness. So if we would have a vocational training and sort of apprenticeship program to enable anybody who would like to get into farming to learn how to do it successfully and not just go out on the land and fail the way a lot of first-time farmers do when they think we just go out and plant seeds and they grow. If we gave people that training and then had a way to make their work high-paying enough so that it was seen as a prestigious line of work and not as a sort of just a redneck or bumpkin sort of peasant work, I think that's how we could develop a more sustainable system that was more beneficial to society generally, produced higher quality food, less damage to our natural environment, and enabled people to reconnect with that land-based production in a way that wouldn't be backbreaking and grinding and impoverishing, but instead would build up culture outside of our urban centers. But that would really take a revolution in the way we think about farming and who does farming and how farming gets done and how we value it. Not seeing farmers as people who just apply the products and the instruction of government agencies and corporations, but seeing them as a sort of master of a profession that is requires every bit of scientific knowledge and expertise as any other highly trained field.
Hello.
Yeah. Okay. Is Jim still there?
Jim, I think he's gone.
I think he left us.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, he has the Bible verse for the end of the show, but...
I'm back.
Okay. Welcome back.
All right. What I was going to say, in fact, what I did say, but I said it on mute, sorry, is we had a number of questions having to do with organic methods and organic farming, but we only have maybe another 5 or 10 minutes left. I wonder, Christopher, if you couldn't summarize the thread of organic focus, what counts as organic, and why it's important. And maybe we could do 5 minutes of that, and then we could come to the close. Did I lose you all?
No, I'm here. I was on mute too.
It's catching. I'm telling you.
No, it's a
you know,
viral
sometimes in the state of Kansas, half the state's on mute.
No,
and they don't even notice it. I don't know why I pick on Mario this way, just because his team cheated its way to the Super Bowl victory. Well, that's a disgusting aside. Go ahead, Christopher.
Okay, well, just the whole question of organic farming is, it seems like there's organic farming, in California where I lived, there was some rather big organic farmers, and some farmers would tell me they're not really organic farmers because they don't really take care of the land. in a sufficient way. The question of organic farming, what is it? What elements distinguish it from conventional farming? Those are the questions we were talking about. And maybe this would be better for if we could have another show on this, that would be good. Because I think it's a very important question. Does it really matter whether we farm organically or not, whatever organic farming is? And how can organic farming actually produce the vaunted results of what has been called the Green Revolution? I don't know if you have any just preliminary thoughts on that, Zeb.
Yeah, so to explain what exactly organic farming is very briefly, it's sort of a baseline guideline that's now in America legally established by the USDA, and it prohibits the use of synthetically produced fertilizers and pesticides. There's a few other requirements. If you're talking about, it also prohibits genetically modified organisms. In animal agriculture, it prohibits the use of antibiotics and hormones in the animals that you're using for either milk or meat. And there's a few other like practices that it requires and prohibits, but the main thing is no use of synthetically produced fertilizers, pesticides, antibiotics, hormones, or genetics. And so it's really just a baseline. It doesn't guarantee that the production is good for the environment or that the food is higher quality necessarily, but it does eliminate some major sources of concern and of problems and of those externalities that I talked about before. And so it's certainly possible for a technically certified organic producer to sort of game the system and find ways to produce that are highly efficient and productive, that don't use the prohibited items but still cause major problems for the environment. And more we're seeing the corporate agriculture world develop. As the organic market grows, they rush in to fill that niche and to take advantage of that opportunity and produce things in ways that are not great. They're better than conventional because they don't use a lot of those toxic chemicals, and a lot of those things also are highly, they use a lot of carbon in their production, especially nitrogen fertilizer, so that organic is better by any stretch than conventional if you're talking about industrial versus industrial. But it doesn't guarantee that it's not the highest bar you can reach. It's not what we should be aiming for and be satisfied with. But what it does do is offer a more level playing field because the small and medium-sized farmer can substitute know-how and expertise and cultural practices like just where and how they plant what, the timing, and things like that come more from observation and education. They can substitute those in place of bought-in inputs like organic fertilizers and organic pesticides. They can have a more integrated and holistic production system. And because the price of organic stuff is higher, they can compete with the industrially produced organic food. So it certainly creates an opportunity for small farms that wouldn't be there without it. And it's definitely a move in the right direction, even if it's not the end point of where we want to get to.
All right. Thank you. I have two non-scientific concluding postscripts to steal a line from Kierkegaard. And then we'll end with the gospel for today. The first thought is we could hardly talk about real progress, real development in agriculture if, as part of that, as central to that development, we have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer family farms. That's just not acceptable. Second postscript comes from the late and perpetually great Peter Morin, co-founder of the Catholic Worker, who oftentimes spoke of cult culture and cultivation. And Christopher earlier on in the hour talked about the link between culture and cultivation. But what about cult? It seems to me that what's so crucial ultimately about agriculture and the way of life that surrounds agriculture is the closeness to life. The closeness to life. And just as a kind of an absurdist kind of riff, imagine the offertory in the Catholic literature if instead of reference to bread and wine, the reference was to plastic and microchips. Please accept our gifts of plastic and microchips. That would suggest a devastating divorce from life and creation. And I think that there is this profoundly important bond between culture, and cultivation. Our God is a living God, and we want to be in touch with life in a fundamental way, and agriculture certainly allows us to do so. We end, as always, with the gospel from today's liturgy, and this is from Matthew. As Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and scourged and crucified. And he will be raised up on the third day." Then the mother of the sons of Zebedee approached Jesus with her sons and did him homage, wishing to ask him for something. He said to her, "What do you wish?" She answered him, "Command that these two sons of mine sit, one at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom." Jesus said in reply, "You do not know what you are asking. Can you drink the chalice that I am going to drink?" They said to him, "We can." He replied, "My chalice you will indeed drink, but to sit at my right and my left, this is not mine to give, but is for those for whom it has been prepared by my Father." When the 10 heard this, they became indignant at the two brothers. But Jesus summoned them and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and that the great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. Rather, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave. Just so the Son of Man did not come to be served, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." The Gospel of the Lord. Come, Lord Jesus, come. Thank you so very much. Sebastian will put the podcast together, and I will post it. And Zeb, I think you had so much to offer us, and we so greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you for having me on.
Take care. Goodbye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.